let's see. So we were talking about the Quran last week as an overview, and I did a little more kind of reading and skimming through it and some research, and learned even more interesting things about it that I thought I would toss out to you. I think that we did mention last week that since Muhammad had a respect for both Christianity and Judaism, the Quran itself speaks very highly of both the Old and the New Testaments. It refers to them as the former books, and it says that they have all been revealed by God. And I mentioned this a little bit last week, but I've learned even more that the Quran tells many stories of many people from the Bible, but it differs in a lot of the details. So it includes stories on Adam, Enoch, Noah, Abraham, Lot, Ishmael, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, Job, David, Solomon, Elijah, Elisha, Jonah, Aaron, Moses, Zechariah, John the Baptist, and Jesus. They're all mentioned in the Quran as prophets of God. There are also stories in there about Cain and Abel, Gideon, King Saul, David and Goliath, Sodom and Gomorrah, Hannah, Miriam, and many others. Which one is interesting because I would not have assumed all of those people from the Bible are mentioned. And get this, Moses is mentioned in the Quran more than any other person is mentioned in the Quran. Jesus is mentioned more often in the Quran than Muhammad is mentioned. And Mary is mentioned in the Quran more than she is in the New Testament. Although, of course, there are stories that are in there that are not in our New Testament. Still, very interesting. And in the Quran, chapter 3, verse 3, it says, "It is God who sent down to thee, step by step, in truth, this book, confirming what went before it. And he sent down the law of Moses and the gospel of Jesus before this as a guide to mankind, and he sent down the criterion of judgment between right and wrong." So, very, very interesting. And if anyone does want to kind of flip through, either during the lesson tonight or over the next week, skim around if you see like a name or a person who is also in our Bible, compare and see what's the story about them that's included in the Quran. Is it different? Is it similar? Is it totally different? Or is it totally similar? Either one. So let us know what you find. Okay, before we start our discussion tonight, remember that about 2 years ago, we did that series of all the branches of Christianity and all the denominations, and we learned about all different kinds of other kind of Christian branches and churches. And when we started that, at the very beginning, I asked the question, does every branch and every denomination of Christianity agree on everything? Now, you all said no, and I'll take your word for it, okay? And I said, well, maybe just the Protestants then, since the Catholics in the Bible they use have a few more books than ours. At least all Protestant denominations having the same Bible, they all agree, right? You said no, I'll take your word for it. I said, okay, well then at least we know that all Baptists agree on everything, right? No, not so much. Not even one branch of one branch of one branch agrees on everything. So just that as a way to think about it, how could we have so many different expressions and denominations in Christianity, even among Protestants, even among Baptists? How could that happen, just in general?
People are different.
People are different, yeah. They might have different tastes or preferences. Mm-hmm. Yeah. How else could so many branches branch off?
I don't know, but could it be definitions?
Yes.
Within cultures and peoples, and
Yes.
so when they read the Bible, the definition to them is different because of how they grew up or
Yes.
where they're affiliated.
Yes. And so we can see that Lutheranism comes from Germany, and so it's impacted by Martin Luther and German thinking. Episcopalians, Anglicans come from England, the Book of England, they're influenced by that. And it's interesting to kind of trace back where these people were from, Presbyterians and Calvin and Switzerland, and they all kind of come from somewhere, and usually the somewhere is maybe a disagreement or a difference of interpretation. Or like Cosette said, one person says, well, I read the Bible and it tells me to do this. Another person says, well, I read the Bible and it tells me to do this. And so they say, well, great, we'll see you later, and hopefully we won't see you later because you're totally wrong. And the other group says, that's fine, you're totally wrong, in my opinion, so never mind. That's all right, we're happy on our own. It's a very similar effect in Islam as well, because like Marshall said, people are different, and Islam is composed of people. People from different countries, different backgrounds. And so when they read their holy book, the Quran, they come up with different expressions and interpretations of it. And tonight, as we talk about these different groups within Islam, I'm going to use the word denomination, even though it's not a real kind of exact translation, but that's just a word that we kind of know what it means. So I'm just going to kind of use that word. And a lot of the English words that we use when we're talking about Islam are kind of translations of Arabic words. So that's why you might see them spelled differently. Like sometimes Quran might have an apostrophe in it, or sometimes it doesn't, or sometimes it's spelled with a K, or sometimes Muslim is spelled different. That's because they're all English estimations of an original Arabic kind of word. So, we're going to talk about the different denominations in Islam tonight, and there is a range to them, just like there's all different kinds of Christian denominations on a spectrum, and the ones in Islam can range from extremely strict and old-fashioned and very rigid or conservative, and there's a whole range and spectrum all the way to very modern, very progressive, very liberal expressions of Islam. And much like it is for other religions around the world, there's going to be sort of differences in groupings among more rural areas that might be less industrialized. They might have sort of an older approach to it, compared with Muslims in urban areas, in big cities, in metropolises. They're going to have a little more modernized approach to it. Okay, let's do some handouts. First, I've got 4 handouts left over from last week. Does anybody want any handouts from last week? I see, there we go, okay. I'm going to give those to you all, and you give these to Joe and Sue. Anybody else want one from last week? Okay, Kathy. Paul, can you give one to Kathy as well? So now we have some new ones for this week, and anyone watching from home, I will try to attach a PDF in the video description below. Let's see, Jane, as our official passer-outer, you do it so well. I know. She practices all week. So these are our handouts for this week. If you could, thank you so much, deputize. So I'll go over what's in the handout, and I'll try not to read every single word that's in the handout because you all can read too. I'll try and just give the highlights. And these are some of the words in here we're going to cover are things that you all said you wanted to kind of learn the differences of when we first started. And you'll see that the 2 big groups are like the 2 big branches in Islam. Similar to how Christianity might have the 2 biggest branches of like Catholics and Protestants would be kind of like the 2 biggest branches of Christianity. Islam has its 2 big main branches of Sunni and Shia. But of course, there's a few little ones along the way, smaller denominations, you might say, and each time there was a split, just like in Christianity, it was a difference over leadership, who gets to call the shots, what kind of shots are called, what the rules are, who's in charge, that kind of thing. So we're going to go over the main ones, but again, it doesn't cover every group, and even since we all admitted that if you can't even say this is what all Baptists believe, that can get you into tricky waters. Then again, take what I'm saying about what Muslims believe with the biggest grain of salt you can get, since I am no scholar of Islam. I'm just very interested and curious. So those two big branches, Sunni and Shia, they separated after Muhammad died in 632. And that's a trend that you see in other religious movements. When the big influential leader and founder dies, then the rest of the group might kind of scatter, or there's leadership vacuum, or there's leadership kind of conflicts over who gets to inherit it or not. And that's what plagued Islam for the next few decades. And you can see that the leaders after Muhammad were called caliphs, or caliphs. And eventually it led to a civil war when Muslims split in the late 600s. And that's when the two big branches kind of formed their differences, Sunni and Shia. So first let's talk about the Sunnis. They are the biggest branch. They consider themselves like the standard of Islam. And I was surprised that they are 80% of all the Muslims in the world, just about. And their origins and the Shia origins, it can get very detailed and specific about they follow this caliph versus this son and this person. So I didn't fool with a lot of those details, but you're welcome to go see which specific caliphs the Sunnis and Shias follow. But like we mentioned last week, there are some other writings that are attributed to Muhammad or about Muhammad, and those are called Hadith and Sunnah. And that's where the Sunnis get their name from, because along with the Quran as their holy book, they do use those further writings by and about Muhammad as their guide. So they use the Sunnah, and they are called Sunnis. Now the other group, the Shia, is a little smaller, but they are more intense, you could say, and they control a few key countries, which is why they are still very important. So the Shia are the second largest branch in Islam, with about 15% of Muslims, and they consider themselves like maybe the elite or the best expression of Islam. Unlike how Sunnis would use the Sunnah and the Hadith, the other writings, Shias do not. They reject those extra writings, and the Shia rely more heavily on religious leaders called Ayatollahs. And we'll talk a little bit more about that vocabulary word in a minute. But they see their religious leaders, their Ayatollahs, as signs of God on earth, who speak God's revelations and rules, but Sunnis do not care for that. So if you ever see a person who is an Ayatollah, that can tell you, oh, they must be a Shia, because Shia have Ayatollahs as their religious leaders. Sunnis do not. And then lastly, like the next smallest group is called the Sufi, and there's not many of those, but you might have heard that term, so I did want to mention it. And it is almost humorously equivalent that in Christianity we have Catholics and Protestants, and we also have Eastern Orthodox Christians, like Greek Orthodox, Russian Orthodox, etc., who kind of do their own thing. It's kind of like a little smaller third branch. They're a little different, and their services are very thick with like the air of spiritual mystery, you might say. They have kind of like an air of mysticism. They've got big robes, big beards, lots of incense, a lot of ritual and recitations. So it is kind of interesting that they would be an equivalent of Sufism, because the Sufis are more of a mystical kind of group of Islam. They discourage materialism. They try to be spiritually pure, to focus on their relationship with God. So they practice more meditation, more prayer. And if you've ever heard the term, if you're interested, a Sufi monk is called a dervish. And sometimes, as part of their ceremony, to achieve a sort of spiritual ecstasy, they will spin and spin and spin around. So they're called whirling dervishes. You ever heard the term whirling dervish? Or if you've heard in The Sound of Music, how do you solve a problem like Maria? The nuns say, she's a pest. She'd drive a hornet out of its nest. She would throw a whirling dervish out of whirl. That's how much of a problem Maria was in The Sound of Music. Is that she would throw a whirling dervish out of whirl, which I imagine would be very painful because they spin around very, very fast. So that's where that word comes from. If you've ever heard that, or if you ever see the people spinning, you can go, they must be a dervish. That is a monk in the Sufi tradition, which is a small branch of Islam. Okay, let's talk about some current tensions. So just like originally the Sunnis and the Shias did not get along and they kind of sprung out of a civil war, it is true that even these days there is a lot of tension between Sunni groups and Shia groups. And I don't want to make overgeneralizations and say that it's 100% this way all the time. But it is true that around the world there is real tension between some Sunni groups and some Shia groups. That's not everywhere. And I would wonder, and hopefully we can get somebody from the Islamic Center of Asheville to return my many phone calls. I wonder if congregations in the States, since they'd be probably made up of immigrants from different countries, I assume that they would have both Sunni and Shia Muslims within their church, and they would cooperate and do their own thing. So that's a question that I would have of a person, should they be able to come here. I'm working on scheduling that, see if we can make that happen. But what would their religious community be like if they're made up of different sort of denominations, kind of all at the same time? I wonder if it's like, sometimes you might go overseas and there might be a Christian church in another country that's sort of non-denominational, because it's just, we're the Christian church in town and we're the only one, so anybody who's a Christian, you just kind of go to that town. And if you've gone to other countries, then you might have kind of experienced that, just a general, maybe evangelical kind of church kind of situation. But like I said, there is a lot of tension around the world between Sunni and Shia, and the most extreme on both ends consider the other group heretics. Much like in all those branches of Christianity, whenever they would split off, they would say, we're splitting off because you're doing it wrong. And the original group would say, we don't care, you can go because you're doing it wrong. Well, Sunnis and Shias think that the other is doing it wrong on the extreme ends of the spectrum. Now, like I said in the handout, you can't overgeneralize and say that every Sunni group gets along with all the other Sunni groups. And you can't say that all the Shia groups get along with all the others. But they tend to have a natural relationship with each other if they are of the same kind of group or denomination. And like I said in the handout, that makes it really tricky for U.S. foreign policy, because there might be one country that we are allies with, but because they might be Sunni or Shia, then they might also be allies with some group that we really, really are not allies with, and that we are at loggerheads with. And we'll talk about this in a minute, but that's kind of the running theme of U.S. relations in the Middle East and parts of Southeast Asia, is that we just kind of don't understand this, what's a 1,400-year history of conflict, and we'll kind of insert ourselves and think we know what to do, and y'all are our friends and y'all are our enemies. But then we find out that like the friends of our friends might also be our enemies, but the friends of our enemies might be our friends too, and it's easy for us to kind of get all mixed up. You tell me, have we ever gotten mixed up in Middle East politics before? Yeah, right. So it gets tricky. So I wanted to list on the handout some major Sunni groups that you might have heard of, like in the news, and some major Shia groups. And we can see how they might work against each other or with each other. So, Saddam Hussein's government, for example, he and his government were mostly Sunni Muslims, but a majority of the country of Iraq was Shia. So it was a very tense, conflicted situation. Now in Saudi Arabia, both the people of the country and its government are Sunni. The majority of the people and their government are Sunni, so they all kind of get along. They haven't really had much civil war in Saudi Arabia, but we will get into some other kind of minor sects in a little bit of Sunniism. Iran and its government are mostly all Shia, and that's kind of where the Shia are really most prevalent in the world is Iran. But both the government and most of the people are Shia. So you can see why Iraq and Iran didn't get along well in the 1980s, because Saddam Hussein was in charge of Iraq in the 1980s, the Sunni, and Iran was a Shia country in the 1980s, so they did not get along. A majority of Syria is Sunni, but most of the Syrian government is Shia. So Syria has just had a terrible time over the past, 5 years, 6 years of civil war against President Bashir, who really does not care about his population at all. They've had a real tough time. Al-Qaeda is a Sunni group. Houthi rebels in Yemen. Yemen's had a real hard time the past 4 years with rebels and civil war. The Houthi rebels are Shia. The Taliban in Afghanistan is Sunni. Hezbollah in Lebanon is Shia. So you can see how, we might start working with one country or not, or be allies with this group or not, and they might have a relationship with this other group, and we might really not, and that just makes it messy. It's kind of like stepping into, I don't know, if you go to, maybe you marry into a family, you go to a family reunion, and you don't know who all is mad at each other because of who all said what, 30 years ago, and then you're accidentally too nice to the one person that, your mother-in-law can't stand, or something like that. But it's kind of like that, like we just didn't know, we stepped into it, and boy, did we step into it, and we've kind of been suffering the consequences. Okay, let's go to some vocab words, and we're going to circle back to some Sunni and Shia info in a minute. So be thinking if you have any questions. So the vocab words, halal is the type of food that is permissible for Muslims, much like Jews have their kosher foods. We talked about Ayatollah a few minutes ago, and it's a religious leader among the Shia. And I'm saying it's kind of like an archbishop level of religious authority. Like Catholics have a lot of level of religious authority. And Ayatollah would, let's say we could translate it to an archbishop kind of level. They are utmost experts on the Quran, Islamic law, philosophy, etc. Interestingly, the title only started being used about 100 years ago or so in Iran, and super respected Ayatollahs can achieve the rank of Grand Ayatollah, which I'm going to say is kind of like a cardinal in the Catholic Church. They're like one step above archbishop. And there are about 63 Grand Ayatollahs in the world now. Strangely, most of them have their own websites. So if you are curious, you can look them up on the web. And so this was something that I was curious about. I just kind of had it in my head, uninformed, white Baptist Christian that I am, that there was one Ayatollah, and that he was in Iran, and he kind of ran the show, which is kind of true, but not. So in Iran, the person that we call the Ayatollah is the person that is the supreme leader of Iran, who also is an Ayatollah. There's lots of Ayatollahs. The one who's the supreme leader of Iran when we hear in the news, like the Ayatollah, it means their supreme leader. But there are other people with that title and that position. The supreme leader of Iran is the ultimate head of state and of the church at the same time, like Ayatollah Khomeini, you might have heard about in the past. And then after he died, the current one is Ayatollah Khamenei. And they are above the president. Like the president of Iran is in charge of the government. And then above that, the supreme leader, who is an Ayatollah, is the head of the state, the government, the religion, everything. That kind of makes sense? Clear as mud? Yeah, I was learning a lot about, especially kind of Iran history, as we'll get into some more vocab words here. So, as we said earlier, we talked about some of the original caliphs, and they run a caliphate, which would just be some kind of area or some kind of region, and a caliphate is ruled by a caliph who rules politically and religiously. So it's just, a caliphate would be some region that is ruled by a caliph who rules politically and religiously. Some are hereditary, some are based on elections. And then I just want to throw in other positions of authority and come up with some analogous kind of English terms. Again, all the English kind of translation terms I'm coming up with are not an exact translation, but it helps me kind of compare and gauge what we're talking about. So a Shah is a king, an Emir is a prince, and a Sultan is a ruler or governor. So what's the Shah that we kind of all heard about or think about when we think of Shah? What is it? The Shah of Iran. Yeah, that's kind of like when we hear Ayatollah, we think of the Ayatollah of Iran. When I hear Shah, I think the Shah of Iran. And the Shah of Iran, back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, he was the king, the monarch. He happened to be very authoritarian, and the U.S. helped force him into power in 1953 through a coup that overthrew the democratically elected prime minister of Iran at the time. And I don't know, I mean, I wasn't reading the news in 1953. I don't know if anyone said, I don't know if it's a good idea to support a coup to overthrow a democratically elected prime minister. Whether anyone said it in 1953, it certainly proved not to be very good a few decades later in 1979, when the Shah was overthrown by the Iranian Revolution that put the Ayatollah in power. So again, you know, when we step into these cultures that we don't really understand, and we find out that we really are kind of stepping in it. And just me kind of doing more research, it seems that there was one reason that we forced ourselves into Iranian politics in 1953, and it's one word, it's 3 letters. Any guesses? Oil! That's right. They had a lot, and they wanted to control it a little more than us and the British were wanting them to control it. So we were like, oh, we'll get rid of their elected prime minister, and we'll put this Shah in power. What could go wrong? What could go wrong? Okay, next week we will start getting into different Muslims' views on women, but I did, someone had mentioned that when we were thinking about stuff we want to learn, like the roles and the rights of women in different Muslim societies. But I did find this little chart that I put on the handout, since there are different types of veils and headgear and scarves. And the first one is the one that would be most commonly seen, the hijab. It's just a scarf that goes around the head and kind of around the neck and would kind of cut off around here. Then sort of the next level up, the qador, would be a cloak that covers a little more of the forehead and the hair. Some go to the shoulders, some can be full length. The niqab is it covers more because it covers everything here, leaving only the eyes open. And you'll see that's used in places influenced heavily by Wahhabi Islam, So, next question, what's Wahhabi Islam? Wahhabi Islam was a revival movement among Sunnis in Saudi Arabia during the 1700s. Its founder, Abd al-Wahhab, wanted to take his religion back to its roots. He thought that religion had gotten distracted and gotten off course, so he wanted to kind of bring it back to its pure roots. And the popularity of Wahhabism rose in Saudi Arabia so much that they established a strong connection with the government. So niqabs will be very widely used in Saudi Arabia because they are influenced by Wahhabism, and that is one sect within Sunni Islam. So the last one, the burqa, that's the most serious kind of coverings. They would be meant for women going out in public, but not inside their own home when they're just by themselves. They cover the whole body with a net that hides the eyes, traditionally worn by the Pashtun people in Afghanistan, also encouraged by the Taliban in Afghanistan. So, next question, what are the Pashtun people? The Pashtuns are an ethnic group, a people group in the Middle East that spread from like the very eastern part of Iran. They go through southern Afghanistan and into northwest Pakistan. That's where the Pashtun people live. And they have their own language, Pashtun. And once you start looking at people groups on that side of the world, you realize that there's all these big blobs of people groups, but they don't match any of the borders of any of the countries. That's because after big wars, the Western powers would kind of get out the map and go, okay, this country is this, you can have it, Britain. This country is this, and you can have that, France. And they would draw these borders, but didn't really respect where these people groups were. So the Pashtun people, kind of like the Kurdish people, like the Pashtun people spread across these different countries and borders, but there is a lot of them in Afghanistan. I think I read that maybe 50% of Afghanistan might be Pashtuns. And this was really interesting. I definitely didn't know. It is a common belief among the Pashtun people that they are descendants of Jews after the 12 tribes of Israel were dispersed in exile. They believe the tribe of Joseph, among others, moved to that area of Afghanistan, eastern Iran, northwest Pakistan. So if you ever see the name like Yusufzai, as in Malala Yousafzai, that name Yusufzai comes from Joseph. Malala is a Pashtun person, a family's Pashtun, and they really believe it's their belief, their belief, but they come from the tribe of Joseph and other Israelite tribes, which is really, really fascinating. So as we end tonight, think about all the stuff that we've talked about tonight. What things did you hear that have similar beats as groups or branches of Christianity? Not similar beliefs or anything, but what kind of similar processes or just kind of human nature kind of stuff did you hear among different branches of Islam, and you heard some similarities with all the branches of Christianity that we covered? Did you hear any kind of, Mark?
Some have a lot more rules.
Some branches have a lot more rules, yeah. And others are fine to kind of let some things go, yeah. Same was true with different branches of Christianity. Yeah, right.
And also some have very fierce punishment for breaking the rules.
Yes.
Unbelievable fierce punishment.
Yes. Like terribly torturous punishments for breaking those rules. Yeah. And again, those would be more likely to be found in the kind of, let's say, less industrialized areas and countries, whereas in the cities, less likely to find it. Yes. Other stuff, other kind of similar, like human nature approaches, actions, weirdness, funkiness. I did kind of notice, especially talking about like the Wahhabi sect, it sounded similar to some of the smaller branches in the Christian tree where there was like a movement that said, our denomination or faith or whatever has gotten too far away because we've been distracted by modern distractions or whatever. So we need to get back to our roots. We need to get back to the purity of our belief. So you can see that in like the Amish or Mennonites or different peace traditions, the Quakers, how they kind of said like the modern society is getting too crazy. We need to take it back to the roots. And you can see people in Islam doing that same thing, that they would kind of like progress in time would go forward, and they'd say, well, we need to bring the religion back to the roots. And that it seems to be that's kind of the motivation behind Wahhabism as a sect. Let's see. Oh, and the other thing, that the more I thought about the Muhammad story, it had similar beats, not beliefs, but like similar beats. Thinking about when we studied the Mormon Church, how there was this group of people who, or this person who respected both Christianity and Judaism, but then felt that God had delivered this extra revelation and put it out in this extra book. And it attracted many followers because of his, let's say, flamboyance or determination or purpose. Like, people are really attracted to someone with a strong purpose and mission, whether it's good or not, or right or not. Strong, loud leaders will get a following no matter what. And in the Mormon situation, Joseph Smith claimed that God had delivered this further revelation in the Book of Mormon. They started their own movement, and much like the early Muslims, were persecuted amongst the places where they started, like we learned last week. Muhammad claimed that God had spoken this further revelation, put together in this separate book, but then was persecuted amongst the people and had to kind of move around. And when we were studying Mormonism, they had to kind of move around until they could find a place, and they grew big. And then after Joseph Smith died, there was disagreements among leadership. It just kind of shows how human they all are, and it's just remarkable to see those kind of human differences, and how sad it is that some take it to such an extreme, like Ray said, that it can lead to just true violence and vengeance. And that's what we'll be talking about next week, because people had some questions about that, and we'll get into that next week. So let's pause it right there. Good things to think about, and we will pick it up next week. But as you go out into the world, remember that we follow the model of Christ, who called us all to sacrificial love, and that is how the world will be won and the kingdom of heaven will be built, is by demonstrating the sacrificial love of Christ, and not by force, and not by conquest. But let us model that unconditional, selfless love of our Savior this week. So go in peace to love and serve the Lord, and we'll see you next Wednesday.